It's a good
All
time.
right.
It's a good time.
Yeah.
All right, so you should see my title screen and not my desktop, which has job listings
we
on it right
do.
now.
Awesome sauce.
Excellent.
Take
All
it
right.
away.
Hello, all, and welcome to Prevent Heroism, How to Reduce Work Today, or How to Work Today to Reduce Work Tomorrow. See, titles are hard. And in order to get started, I'm just going to talk a little bit about why I was thinking about this particular talk. And this happened actually over the summer when I was listening to the Developer Tea podcast, when the host was actually interviewing Dan Heath, who wrote a book called Upstream that was published over the summer. And he specifically started talking about a public health parable that went a little like this. So you and a friend are in a picnic beside a river. And suddenly you hear a shout from the water because a child is drowning. So, you jump in, grab the child, and swim to shore. But as you're recovering, you hear another child and another and another. So you and your friend keep jumping into the water to pull these children out, but you're struggling to keep up. And then when you look, you see your friend walking away. And you say, "Where are you going?" And he says, "I'm going upstream to tackle whoever's throwing the kids in the water." And that really gets into what we mean, or what I'm going to be meaning when I say upstream. So upstream work is the proactive and preventative work that reduces the need for reactive or downstream work. And this isn't just limited to healthcare. I mean, that's apparently a parable that they share a lot in that industry, but we have our own culture and our own stories. So we have falling downstream, the angry sysadmin, and based on earlier talk, we could say network engineer too. It doesn't matter. We're all angsty. So the angry sysad has a lot of problems. They're usually a highly skilled person. And because they're highly skilled, they're asked a lot of questions because they can answer the fastest. And why wouldn't you ask the person who just knows the answer every time? But of course, that means they're going to keep getting asked the questions. And that cycle is going to self-perpetuate. As a result, they're likely to also work overtime because they're kind of trying to compensate for the time they spent doing not their job, right? Answering these questions. And they want to make sure that they're getting done whatever is queuing up in Jira, what have you. And so they're trying to handle all of this stuff. Customers usually also want to meet them because why meet the people person when you can meet the knowledge bank? And that's going to be another source of stress too, which of course will also apply to internal people because depending on your role, customers can be internal customers, right? And basically they're Brent, for those familiar with the Phoenix Project. Like this, Brent is really the placeholder character for all the Brent alike that just happened in my story, right? Knows so much, gives so much downstream work that he's just always reacting, but he can't do anything preventative to keep that stuff from slipping downstream. And then we have all these results and they're, negative. We don't want this. You have a lot of stress. You also have the impact of that stress. And that basically means that Brent can kind of act out to basically all the care, like coworkers or extended relationships, because when you're a stressed out person, every little thing starts to get to you. But even if you don't have like a specific Brent, you can probably think of a few concurrent global crises that might be making us all just a little bit stressed. And so even if we aren't in that specific situation, even if we aren't the Brent, we kind of start to know how this starts to impact our psyche, right? So you have the anger and the resentment. Why isn't stuff getting done? Why is everyone always asking me? All of my relationships are strained because now I'm barking at you every time you just ask me a question. And maybe it's not ideal that you're asking me the question, but if there's no knowledge base, if we're not doing the other things that stop you from needing to ask me, then it's going to keep happening. And so I'm just going to keep straining that because now you're going to avoid asking me as much as possible. I'm also going to have a lot of time management problems. I'm going to not be able to say, okay, well, this was my work priority and this is how much work I thought I could fit into a week, but now I can fit in less than that, but I really can't afford to fit in less than that. and it's going to make it really difficult. I'm also going to have too many concurrent tasks, and I'm not going to be able to focus on any of them. And I do have a different talk that I give sometime about alert fatigue that touches on this a bit, because the idea is if you don't have properly configured alerts, the alerts distract you. And it's not just, PagerDuty. It's like your email alerts can distract you when you're trying to do other things and you start dropping balls and you can't focus on building the things that need your dedicated attention. There's also something I wanted to define that's called allostatic load, which is the wear in your body due to chronic stress. So it's kind of this brain fog-like state where you're too awake to sleep and too tired to be awake, that unfortunately we're now all too familiar with, but can also happen when you have really stressful, high energy, high burnout working situations. And there are lots of implications of this situation. You're going to have the diminishing returns because you have that brain fog and that split focus and the disturbed sleeping patterns and all of that. And even if you're not the angry sysad yourself, again, you know what it's like to try and work through brain fog and split focus and so forth. You're going to be able to do less, which means over each iteration, sprint, or however you're cycling it, you're going to have less return. You're also, as a business, the reason the business should care about this is turnover. When employees get burnt out, they leave, right? They're going to try and find another company that hopefully will not burn them out, or at the very least, maybe unfortunately, recover during their kind of onboarding period at a new company. This also starts to incur a reputation cost. There's two sides to reputation cost. On the one side, if a company has earned or starts to earn a reputation for burning out its employees, they're going to have a really hard time continuing to replace those employees. But also, you have customers not being able to know what to expect. You're going to return fewer bug fixes, fewer features, fewer. And so you're also going to get a reputation impact on that side as well, which of course will impact financial performance, because customers are going to go elsewhere with their money. And this also, to a point, although not with financial directly, can happen with internal customers too, if you're internal facing, because there's that financial impact of people leaving and needing to be retrained. So I'm not going to live here, but the idea of this story was to kind of outline what having the Brents looks like, but how it can actually impact more than just that, right? Why do we care about downstream work and why do we want to reduce it? And it's not just a human concern, although it is also a human concern. So if you or your team or org or whatever are not already focusing on trying to shift upstream, you're going to need to make a case for these cultural shifts as well. And there's a phrase that nothing happens in a vacuum. And to the point of DevOps, nothing can happen in a silo. So you need buy-in from the people with decision-making power. If you're going to say, hey, all the things, some of what I just said, any new things you turn up to research, all of these things about burnout and turnover and financial implications and et cetera are reasons why I need you to support me to shift my working flow. So let's talk about what that actual shift can look like. Now, first things first, you're going to need to start to brainstorm all of your work done. And this doesn't necessarily, don't stress about being too granular or broad about it, where you're like, oh no, this exceeds scopes or whatever. Just write down everything. You can write it as granular or broad as you want at this stage. Do it for maybe 10 minutes to give yourself enough time to start getting some good ideas. And then once you have the ideas down, you can start shifting them into streams, because more likely than not, you're already doing at least some upstream work, even if it's not intentional. The idea is to make it intentional. And when you do this, you can see where you're already succeeding in that and where you could stand to start to shift the labor. And in order to shift that labor, you need to look for patterns, right? Is it repetitive reactive work? Is it resolvable? And if so, how, right? And once you have that kind of outlined, you can start to switch into an upstream task. So for example, let's say you want to stop a flapping service, and that's going to be preventative, right? So if you wait for it to flap and you see the alerts and you're like, oh, I need to check this box, run this job or whatever, and then it's fixed. Or if you know it's something that you can automate cron job style or something, right? You've just done the upstream work And now that service won't flap unless it actually needs your specific attention. If you plan to work proactively and ensure that the changes don't cause the service to flap by pipelining, you've done a different type of upstream work, right? Because now you have a pipeline. And this can go onwards and outwards. When you're trying to figure out your upstream work, you can subcategorize it. So remediating reactive downstream work can be short or long-term and permanent or temporary. And so as a few quick examples for how I'm using that here, right? If you notice something that can be deleted and then just because you delete it, that prevents it from recurring. Maybe it's something that you no longer need, or it's a dead end point, whatever it is, then that solution can be done quickly. And so it's permanent and short term. You don't need to plan for a long time to get that accomplished. If the solution is re-architecting something, you have to redesign a service, switch from monolith to microservices, whatever it is. It would be permanent and long-term because you're going to do it in stages. A long-term temporary solution on the opposite side would be kind of something that you script and then you kind of mean for that script to not live, but it's going to. So the short term would be the fix, but if you never replace that short term, it's going to become a long-term temporary solution. And you definitely want to catch those whenever they appear, because those are definitely things that you can attack hopefully easily when you're making the shift into doing upstream work. Now that you know scope and frequency and how long it's going to take to do the things, you can look at each thing's impact and time to solve and start to plan in what order and how quickly you can do them. Make sure that you are capacity planning accordingly. And I always make sure to point this out because sometimes we get really stuck on, oh, if you're planning with a 10-person team, but you only have 8, you have 2 open recs, you haven't filled them, you will soon. Don't plan on them being filled, right? And this usually only happens when you're doing things that happen in stages. You might anticipate that after you get to a certain point in the project, you'll have filled a vacancy. Don't assume that. You can always change it once the resources arrive, but don't plan on it in advance or you're going to get burned. And now that you have everything done, you can just start doing it. And I'll admit to avoiding using a logo on this slide. Okay. So every time you go, make sure that you're iterating. Keep track of your success and failures, kind of like postmortems or retrospectives. And you also want to make sure you're not focusing on blame, right? So something might go faster or slower than you expect. You definitely don't want to call that out. Just plan for it next time. And just as a food for thought around that plan and adding buffers and things, there are things that you can do to accommodate known difficulties. This person, this Twitter person that I'm sharing, some people know, her name is Tiffany. Apparently on her team, they have basically a pandemic tax where they're reducing their overall workload by a percentage. And the idea is we know what stress does, and we know that we're now going to have reduced performance with no other problems. It doesn't have to be a pandemic tax, but if you happen to have known difficulties or known obstacles within your company, team, whatever, make sure you're accounting for them when you're trying to plan out logistically, because if you can avoid them or just account for them, that can actually really help you stay on task. And then once you've done all of that, you can totally go back to not playing the goose game while you're working from home. And last but not least, you will need to measure things. And it's important to start to measure things, especially early, so that you can say, okay, this was our baseline before, and now we're going to start shifting our labor. And we want to see if certain things start to improve. And improve, depending on what you're measuring, can mean an increase or a decrease in whatever the metric is. Sometimes this can be a little difficult because you're kind of measuring around the problem, right? A good way to think about it is when you install a traffic light, you cannot measure an accident that didn't happen because each individual accident may or may not have been caused by the lack of traffic light and instead having a 4-way stop or whatever the situation was. But you can measure if the overall number of traffic accidents has decreased. And so when you're thinking about your metrics, you need to kind of think around what you're doing. So now that I've kind of said, you're measuring around it, how do you measure it? So let's keep a few things in mind. First things first, you need to understand your needs. In order to measure your needs, you need to know what they are so that you know if you're measuring them or not. Speaking of, learn how to measure them. It kind of seems odd to maybe say that out loud, but think about the number of times that you thought you were measuring A and it either was outside of scope or the wrong thing and you had to do it again. All right, so try and make sure that you know how to measure what you care to measure. If you are in a position where you can start measuring before you make the labor shift, it's good to have baselines, because when you're trying to prove, especially when you're getting buy-in from other people, when you're trying to prove that it's actually helping, having a baseline to see before and after can really help you. Again, know your capacity. This isn't just about what I mentioned before about not planning around vacant headcounts, but can also be, especially with a long-term project, if you know you're going to be over summer and people are going to be taking holiday or whatever, just kind of adjust for that. You also want to track your rate of change. So the idea with tracking the rate of change is you might find out like the first sprint, you go kind of slow because you're trying to get used to this new normal. And then the next sprint, you might go a little faster, and you can start to accommodate. If your rate of change is relatively consistent, you can say, okay, roughly we can expect this kind of trajectory. And once you have that trajectory, you can say, oh, goals. Who doesn't like goals? But make sure you're always, again, iterating over everything, because it's entirely possible something might wonk up your stuff. So you want to make sure that you're accomplishing or accommodating that. To give you some ideas on how to use metrics, some of these are going to be familiar, but this is how you can use the metrics that we already know with this new idea. So service level agreement, compliance, change failure rate, question volume, Slack keyword mentions, and unplanned work rate. Some of these may actually look familiar because they're common DevOps metrics, but the idea is here, how do they apply to what we're trying to do? And this isn't an exhaustive list. So service level agreement compliance, the idea here is as you're getting better at shifting your labor, you should be better at meeting your agreements. So you should see an increase here. Change failure rate, this is especially helpful if you're pipelining. If you notice that failed deployments are making it to production, you can track how few of them are, like the number should be dropping, or other unplanned failures as you're going through. So you can track that and say, this is showing that we're improving our success because our failure rate is dropping. You also want to track question volume, and how you want to track this goes back to what exactly you're trying to track with it. So for example, let's say that you're using, I don't know, Chef, and you make a major update to Chef. And this could be internal, it could be external, it doesn't matter. You might expect if you're making a change in how people are using something, you'll see questions spike, plateau, and drop. And the idea is you want to see that drop happen, because then you've successfully accomplished the knowledge transfer, whatever you're trying to do, but you also want to make sure that you're grabbing the right questions. You don't necessarily want all questions to drop. You want this subset of questions to drop, which goes into keyword mentions. So again, if you're making a release or something public facing and you see people using a lot of words, depending on what you're trying to track with this, you can pick what keywords you want. You ideally will either see the keywords go up because there's a new feature, or go down because people are having less difficulty using whatever it is. You also want to know what your unplanned work rate is. So the idea is usually those like ad hoc requests that are coming through, if you're successfully switching to Upstream, unplanned work should start to drop. Or you can try and statically plan around it and say, okay, it's going to drop, might not drop to zero. We wish it would. But we can say it might start to plateau, and now we can plan around that, but we want to get it below here. In summary, upstream work is the proactive preventative work, and downstream work is the reactive work. Upstream work reduces stress and its extended impact. And to shift, categorize your downstream work and reduce it. Know what you need to ask and why. Define success and quantify with metrics. And as a reminder, make sure you know what you're measuring and that it's appropriately scoped, etc. If you want to see this presentation, I have the slides with resources on Noticed. And with that, questions?
You're
So-
welcome to unmute yourselves. Go ahead, Boyd.
Okay, I've been doing effectively what you said for the last 18 months. So for anyone who's wondering, does this shit work? It works. However, I am terrible at measuring things. And so you were talking about the categorization of the work of the downstream work. Do you have anything that breaks that down in more detail, examples or anything like that? Because I could sure use that to help us make it to the next step.
So I have a couple on the resources that I'll definitely, as on that notice page, it's still on the bottom of this slide. But in general, I found that a lot of the DevOps KPIs are a good starting point. You just kind of have to shift and scope how you're using them. And that goes back to know what you want. Because if you try and Google, I'm sure you've discovered this when you tried this. If you Google it, you're going to get like 15 best practices and hundreds of metrics to try and use. But if you start to kind of narrow down your question, you can say, oh, well, this bit helps me and this bit helps me. And now I can combine them and build my own metric or shift whatever I'm being suggested to use. And so that's why the metrics can get a little complicated. So like, I mean, you have SLI, SLO, SLA as common metrics. You have production release metrics. I don't know specifically what you're looking to track. It's also important to remember that you will have categories of metrics that are going to be process, human, and technological in general. So process metrics would be like the type of metrics, SLI, SLO, that are measuring how well your process is working. And then you have a human metric, which might be something like unplanned work rate would be related to the human. It's anything that you want to scope out related to the human. And then you have technology metrics, which are the most familiar. Anything like memory, CPU, and stuff that we normally associate with systems and servers is going to be a technology metric. You probably don't need to ask too many questions around those aside from which ones are we measuring. But as for the other two, if you start to ask yourself, okay, we want to measure people. Why? Why do we want to measure people? What do we want to measure about the people? And then say, how are we going to use this information to make sure it's revealed correctly? So like, let's say you're measuring performance in a way of people. If you're measuring it for an org and not a team, it's going to be too broad, right? But if you're using a ticketing system like Jira that doesn't let you scope down correctly, you might only be able to measure for a team or for an org and not a team. So you have to think about how you're getting that data. That's why I'm like, you need to do the how and the why together, because it's entirely possible that however things are set up are either too broad or too granular for what you need, and you either need to aggregate or split something. The same is going to be true of process metrics. You can't always get a good baseline on process, because if you're starting to do a shift, the shift will fundamentally change the process. You're kind of showing that one process is more efficient than another process. But it kind of encounters the same problem as human metrics.
Well, so with respect to that, I really don't think you should measure people, especially individuals, because we get back to what you said. Like my productivity may be reduced because I'm helping somebody else, or there are people on my team who are key players. Our architect in particular, he spends a lot of time assisting other people, which brings his productivity down, but while he's facilitating the productivity of all those around him, right?
So two things. Sorry, are you done or no?
Well, and also I resent people watching me. If you're going to measure my productivity, I'm going to take longer to do everything just because you're watching me.
Okay, yeah, so two things. I'm going to sidestep that last because I hear you, but that's not quite what I mean by productivity metrics. I'm not talking about punch card metrics. A couple of things. When you're measuring things like productivity, you have to define what productivity means. Does productivity mean closed Jira tickets? And if so, is that encompassing? And if not, why? And this goes back to asking questions about what you're measuring and how you plan to use the data. If the data isn't helpful, don't do it. It just wastes time. If it gives a faulty impression, don't do it. It wastes time, right? if you're talking about like, oh, but he's helping other people and I'm helping other people, I would argue that that's part of your productivity metric. Questions asked by coworkers, colleagues, etc., counts as productivity, the way that we measure productivity at PagerDuty anyway. Like that counts. Most people have it in their personal like growth plans and all that stuff, is being able to lead and address other people's concerns. But the other thing that this all touches on is psychological safety. If you're working at a company that is looking to kind of CYA themselves at the expense of you, then human metrics can be abused. If you're looking at a company that is trying to bolster things by saying, hey, you know, more walk-ups happened this week. What's up with that? Oh, we had a faulty process and now everyone needs to ask questions about it. We should fix it. If you know that the metrics are in good faith, having it can be incredibly useful. But if not, again, it can produce harm. So you just need to know what situation you're dealing with before you make that kind of recommendation.
Real quick, Q, can you turn off sharing so everybody can see each other again? Real quick. And if anybody else
no one can see each other ever again.
Well, maybe we can see each other on video anyway. So more questions.
No, I'm teasing.
So Q, there's this famous statement, tell me how you measure me and I'll tell you how I behave. And I'm really wrapped around that axle, right? Because when I set out to put this notion in place, I was very much focused on let's drill the intent so that we're not trying to game the metrics. But I'm at a point now where I'm going to be going from a team of 5 folks I manage to a team of 12 folks I manage, which is a heck of a span of control. And so I need these summaries, these numbers, these summative things. Sorry, Bailey, to help me know that the team is healthy and to ask the team the right questions. So are there any? I mean, you sort of laid some things out, but are there any specific pitfalls? Is there a particular story you can tell of something you've seen? Ooh, don't do that, or or absolutely do this. It was super successful in this particular situation.
I mean, the biggest thing you can do, especially with human metrics, is again establish psychological safety. So it's not about the metric; it's about people's trust in you to not abuse them with it. I can give tons of examples on both sides, but what you'll find in every case is whether or not there was psychological safety. For example, I once worked at a place where a manager decided seemingly at random to start time clocking us with Slack. When he would see our notification go on, he determined that we were online. And if it went off, that's when we stopped working, which doesn't account for people to close Slack during the day for interruptions. And it became very contentious and stressful. And it turned out that the reason for this was he had set an expectation with somebody else that he hadn't conveyed to the team, and he was getting anxious about it, right? So there was like a communication flub that he was trying to accommodate. And as you can imagine, even before we knew there was a communication flub on the team side, psychological safety is inhibited because you can feel when someone's micromanaging you. That is not a good faith request that's coming down the pipe. But if he had established psychological safety and said, I need to know approximate workload, for example, to know, so like the way that we measure it at the teams that I'm on in PagerDuty, but we don't do something like time carding because that's not what you want to address. What they said is they want me to tell my manager if my workload is at capacity or not for me. I determine that. And then my manager uses everybody on the team's individual capacity measurement to know if she should be pinging the whole team for something or a subset of the team that's more free than a different subset of the team to say, hey, we got this request. I don't need to ping everyone, but I can ping you because you're at 80% and they're at 100. But she's established the psychological safety to ask these questions, right? So you can totally ask that question if you have a good candor with your team.
It makes perfect sense. I went off and developed a Confluence page, if you will, for folks to track their vacation, because we have the unlimited vacation, which generally means you're way limited on your vacation. And I have concerns that folks aren't getting enough time off. However, the message I got from the team was not, Boyd, we think you're going to do evil, but we're concerned because this is public information that somebody else might decide to do evil with it. which was kind of an eye opener for me. I realized that's naive, but hey, you know. So I think I have a pretty decent understanding of what you're saying there. Thank you.
Yeah.
Come on, y'all. I'm gonna interrogate this woman. You got to help her out because you know I got a million questions about stuff like this.
If you're not comfortable unmuting, you can leave it in the chat, and I'm more than happy to read it out for you because I know some people aren't comfortable on the stream. So
that's the dulcet tones of Laura Santa Maria reading your question.
Laura should still do her own radio show, I think.
Something like that, baby. You never know. You might see a podcast coming out for me. But
you do have the mic for it. Excellent.
I know.
I'd like to revisit what you said. Like, nobody wants to be micromanaged. And I think that all of us know when we're slacking and when we're not slacking, right? And like the example of you being available on Slack versus not is a horrible metric. I don't know who thought that up, but that's just asinine. But what I'm saying is, like, you know, when you get new leadership in a team, they're going to try to watch everybody, right? But what I'm saying is, like, you need to evaluate the effectiveness of the team, not the effectiveness of the individual. Does that make sense?
I can see it both ways. And so again, so like just to use my current team again as an example, and again, reining in on that psychological safety, like you do want to measure team effectiveness for anything the manager reports up. But I think when you have a good repertoire for your specific manager between you, your team, and your manager and your little microcosm there, the fact that my manager is able to tell and say, these people are, you know, saying to me, because she's not asking why we feel we're at 100% or 80% or 60%. And we're not qualifying what 60 versus 61% is either. She's relying on us. There's trust there that we will say when we feel like we're roughly at half, more than half, completely overblown in terms of our workload. And then we trust her to triage effectively down. Now, if you don't have a manager that's doing that or needs to do that, then I would say you don't need that metric, right? Because it depends on how your requests are coming through. As a developer advocate, we don't do tickets in that way. Like, we have a Trello board for things, but we don't have inbound. We don't do Jira tickets like I did when I was working as an SRE. If you have an inbound mechanism that you can load balance, you probably don't need that metric either, right? Because the team structure or the pipeline structure for how things are coming into the team takes care of it for you. So that also goes back to asking how and why. Like, if you want to ask how your individual teammates are feeling in terms of how they're performing, and you don't need to know that information because something else is taking care of it, why, right? It's only to cover a different need. If there's no answer to why, you don't need it.
And a lot of it, I think, comes down to the relationship between the manager and the individuals on their teams. If they don't have a good established relationship, you as a leader intuitively need to know how your team is doing. If you see somebody in a trouble spot, have a conversation of what is going on in your life. Do I need to adjust your workload? Or something of that nature if you're seeing that in a performance, because I've been in organizations now that are implementing tools like Get Prime and other things that are clocking and tracking exactly the number of commits that people are doing a day and using that as a metric of how effective they are. When I could write a bot that would literally sit there and make a dummy commit just to satisfy the number. And the engineers end up feeling like those metrics are weaponized against them because they're used for reviews. And so in our organization, we have tons and tons of engineers. I recently told one guy on my team he wasn't effective. I'm like, your throughput's not what I know you can do. What's going on? And I said, take a week off, go, just unplug. And he came back and he was at 110% when he came back. So I think it's that intuitive thing that once you get outside of that direct leader, the skip levels starts to get lost. And that's where the team metric average overall becomes much more important to share in terms of that. And then also being very proactive, especially if you have a PO who's technical with engineering groups, making sure that they're protecting the team and understanding this is the amount of work that has to happen. And then also training leadership to understand that any cultural shift you have, we went through training, we're building a new skill, that your throughput is going to be different. So always measure what's delivered, not the team intrinsically itself. measure the value of what's being delivered out to the
Right.
customer.
And that's
or
what
other
gets
places.
reported up, like anonymized and reported up. But
Yep.
I would also argue that, again, only in a situation where the manager's actually establishing psychological safety, not when they think they are. A lot of people talk about burnout culture. How do you miss burnt out engineers? By not asking them questions. Because you find out when if they feel like they can give you a review on the way out the door, their exit interview, you're finding out when they leave or assuming when they leave that they were burnt out. You could have addressed it, but you didn't have the relationship that would have allowed you to ask.
Yeah, and then many times I've seen this is the case of engineers who have been promoted into leadership roles who only went that route because they wanted to make more money or felt like they had to progress in their career at that organization. They get siloed and they never received the training or don't have the skills to lead people and have the skills to have those conversations or intuitively know what's going on with their team.
So it's interesting, Oliver, you're arguing that a skill that a manager should have is this innate intuition. And yet the people who get promoted into management are often great engineers, and they're great engineers because their EQ is pretty low and they've been able to focus on slamming code out the door for years and years and years. And so it seems like maybe between you and Q, there's this we've identified a gap, which is to say if somebody's going to move into people leadership, they should be trained to that. They should have their emotional quotient raised. They should be taught what building a safe environment looks like, and things of that nature. And as I'm thinking about the last few scrolls I've made through Twitter, I never see the notion of how do you qualify a manager as a topic of conversation. And in a lot of ways, Q, it seems like one of the things you're relying on, you keep bringing up that psychological safety, right? Which is so important. But, and you just kind of mentioned it, you think you're doing it, but you're not. So, yeah. I mean, that puts me on an edge because I'm like, gosh, I thought I built it and not, and then, well, if I go ask them, is that, so now I've got the observer effect going and all that,
There are books on this topic, like Radical Candor is a good book on the topic. Mm-hmm. Yes. And I would say, you said there's a gap. I don't know if there's a gap. I mean, there's a gap in the industry, but like between what he's saying and what I'm saying, you need to train your managers. If you do not train your managers to be people and to manage people, they're not going to manage people. Or if they're an engineer and they think that pushing code or closing tickets or whatever is their job and that the people management, like the people interactions are secondary. I mean, that was true when they were an engineer, maybe not ideally, but maybe it's certainly not true when you're a manager. Because you're going to also have to deal with the human problems. You're going to have to deal with someone who just moved house or someone who just had a baby and they're underpowered and they're just coming back from parental leave. Or you're going to have two teammates who had a miscommunication and are now there's ruffled feathers. And in order to keep the toxicity down, you're going to need to manage that. And that is all manager training. And if you don't have it, you need to acquire it through reading or something. You need to bridge the gap.
My goodness, one of the things you just mentioned there, I've been through this a couple of times and it's been a decade or more, is conflict resolution training. You spend 3 days and you learn how to defuse and all the other gobbledygook, right? I wonder why.
Gobbledygook.
I wanted to be.
It's not gobbledygook when you're a manager.
This is me shaking my fist. You're not making a safe place for me.
You're in the position of power. It's not meant to be safe for you. It's supposed to be safe for everyone else.
Yeah. That's another thing that I think is really important to point out is, when you move up, it's lonely. It's not like you can go talk about your colleagues anymore. And you can't blow off steam, and you can't necessarily talk about your direct reports because you don't know what the repercussions of that will be. It's something to think about. When you think about that safe space, it gets a hell of a lot less safe the moment you move up, even just one level. It's a really interesting derivative of what the joking that we were just doing. Huh.
Right, but
So
I
if you
think that
consider-
also ties back to the psychological safety of the organization you're working for. Where I work today, I can go talk to my peer cohorts about those things and not worry that it's going to have any direct ramification around there, because there's the trust is set up in the organization that we work in. That's how we operate. Larger organizations, yes, you get matrixed, you get stuck in this realm and it becomes dangerous. But I think that goes back to the culture of the organization that you work with and what they value in terms of how you're handling and managing those relationships as well.
So another question I have is, like, there's a false equivalence between manager and leader. And, managers are a huge pile of people and leaders are a small subset of that pile of people. And so how do you teach managers to be leaders?
I mean, the short answer is manager training. The long answer is researching a lot about human psychology so you can actually give them something that's useful, right? I mean, I name dropped Radical Candor. That's not the only book in this area. I'm sure I can find others that I've rustled up. I'm not a manager. I just read about manager things, apparently.
Well, I think a lot of that has to do with mentorship too. If you have a good mentor from a higher level that can teach you and bring you on that journey, that helps significantly.
Right. And
it's funny. Sorry.
No, I was going to say, like, when I still have like a mentee or two. When I used to do it more heavily, I definitely needed to make sure that I could ride a line in the sand, because if you're too low touch or too gentle with the feedback you're giving, you're not pushing for forward change. But if you come at them heavy-handed, you take them out of their tolerance window. And so there's something it's literally called a window of tolerance for anyone who wants to Google this. But the idea is you're keeping someone within their boundaries for change so that they don't analysis paralysis or not realize there's a problem. Whole lot of research in that area.
I have a question. What if somebody likes being the hero? What if like someone is kind of resistant to this and they sort of like being the hero, but it's kind of like, and they're maybe not necessarily intentionally trying to like sabotage Upstream, but it's more of just this kind of reaction of, I want to be the guy on Slack that responds to all these alerts. How do you deal with that?
More psychology. So think about it. Someone likes being the hero. First question, why? Because behavior meets need. So their behavior is being driven by something. What is it? Is it the recognition? Do they feel like they have to answer every question on Slack because they're not perceived as working otherwise? What is driving the heroic behavior? It could be a reward system as well. So if you're in an organization that maybe unintentionally rewards heroic behavior, you might suddenly find yourself making your own heroes. Usually that can happen. Let's say that someone's not on call, but a really like P1 something happened when they were supposed to be on holiday. And they come in because they know how to fix whatever it is. And they saved the day. And you're just like, oh man, I'm going to pick on Laura. Laura, you saved the day. And you have just reinforced hero culture because now she has come off of her vacation to some issue that she was not actually even responsible for. But you can, if you learn more about psychology, and this is all the pressures on management for this, because teammates, like it helps to not have teammates reinforcing it, but it's the manager's job to make sure it's not happening. Sorry, managers, it's on you. You kind of have to learn how to ride that window of tolerance boundary where you can say, it is great that you knew how to solve that problem, Laura. However, you were on holiday, don't log into Slack. Whatever. But you also need to have the relationship with Laura to be able to praise the good things she did and discourage the behavior you don't want to see.
As Laura, I can agree with that. I approve this message.
Great response. Thank you.
I have what I think is a pretty cool concrete example of what you're talking about. Like I said, I do not believe my people are taking enough time off. I believe that's even more true right now during the pandemic. Yeah. And so, you start with why, right? Why? Or you can go to 5 whys, et cetera, et cetera. But what it boiled down to is I needed a way to make it safe to talk about taking time off. And so I came up with this notion of a simple vacation retro. We have a team meeting once a week, and once a month, maybe once every other month now, that we've gotten better at this. I'll just stop and I'll say, hey, let's have a vacation retro. And for whomever of us have taken time off, the questions are, there's three. One, the week before you took your time off, did you feel like you had to work twice as hard so that you could take that time off? And if the answer is yes, we actually try to create tickets to fix whatever the underlying causes were. Two, while you were away, did you feel the need to check in? Now this one's a little slipperier because some people do feel the need to check in, and it's in their personality that if they don't, they stress out. So did you plan to check in, and did you only check in those times? That's okay. But if you had to check in an unplanned way, we need to fix it. And then the third thing was simply, do you, when you got back, did you have to work twice as hard as you would normally work to catch up? And if the answer again is yes, then we fix it. And this one has an example with it. The last time somebody brought this up, it's just, you end up with this pile of email in your inbox. All right, so what do? Well, your first 4 hours of coming back from a week-long vacation, make sure you're still seen as out of the office and catch up on your email. That was a really simple behavioral or process. I wouldn't quite know how to categorize that, based on the little rubric that you had earlier, Q. But yeah. But it's been really powerful. And what we found is that not only are people doing better, taking time off and being away, that they're actually exchanging in team meeting ideas for taking time off during a pandemic. I can't go to Colorado and go ski, but I could do this instead. So that's been, I think is that an example of the sort of use of psychology to make it safe that you're talking about?
Yeah, you're kind of instilling the trust that, oh, you felt like you had to work on holiday. Why? You need to ask. It's the same with the Slack stuff too, to be honest. So like on our team, we have what are called the rules of engagement. And it has to do with how we react to each other and expectations for that, but also how we react to other teams. And the other teams have a role of engagement too. It's a thing that we do. And one of the ways that it helps with stuff like this is, let's say that one of the lines in the rules of engagement is actually to not check Slack or email while you're off. And this is socialized. I remember I was sick a couple of weeks ago, and prior to that, but after, of course, I joined the company, someone else had been sick with whatever, cold, I don't know, whatever. And when she came back, she's like, I didn't check my email because I was too afraid of Rachel. So I'll be checking it this afternoon, peace. And that's what she said in our team stand up, Rachel being the manager, right? And she was half kidding. But manager says, don't check it. I will see you if you log in. Go be sick. And again, she has a relationship with us where she can say stuff like that pretty directly. But it's also socialized. It's also in our rules of engagement. It's in other teams' rules of engagement. Sometimes people feel like they have to check Slack and email, not just because they don't want to get inundated when they get back, but because there's like a negative pressure or a vacuum in the place of feedback, right? They think they kind of have to, because they won't be able to get back from sick, holiday, whatever, and reacclimate. When I came in the Monday after being sick for a week, I was not immediately bombarded with questions about what happened when I was away. I didn't start get my first question, I can't English today, until the afternoon. Because again, we normalized that behavior. And that's something to think about too. If something's driving a behavior as opposed to someone just being away,
Also related to that, how do I teach people to say no? So, I've got a couple of people who are, again, leaders on my team who are constantly overwhelmed and they've got too much whip, but it's because they won't tell people no.
What happens when they say no? Like hypothetically, I know you're saying you're training them, but like hypothetically.
How would I know? Because they won't say no. If they said no.
No, I'm asking you to kind of model it.
Well, then they have to go to a different resource, right? These people aren't the only resource on the planet. So surely if these people weren't available, they could find the answers somewhere else.
So what's stopping you to just redirect those requests while you're acclimating them to the idea they can say no?
Well, I don't see the traffic first off because
Okay, can you?
Some of it in Slack, yeah, I can. But these are
Okay.
like, the heroes you're talking about. They volunteer. And anytime anybody asks them for something, they just say yes. Like that's their rote response. And really it should be no, because I've already got too much on my plate.
But it is on both you and them, right? So they're not saying no. You want them to say no. You want to show them they can say no. You want to empower their ability to say no. And in order to do that, if you're a manager of leaders, you need to establish something so that they know the difference between a requirement and a request. Are they not saying no because they think everything's a requirement? Are they not saying no because they don't know how to divert? Are they saying no because this is how they are and they need to be retrained because they need to be retrained? And can you have that conversation with them? If you have visibility to the influx of their requests, can you redirect them while you're coaching them as the manager of leaders to be better leaders and teach them that part of leadership is delegation and saying no?
Part of the problem, I work with Bailey. So part of the problem, I think, in what she's talking about, though, is these people are our managers.
Your managers or managers, your managers of managers? Like where's the direction of power in this hypothetical?
At least one of the people, I shouldn't speak for Bailey, at least one of the people who I think has this attribute is our direct manager.
So, okay, so your manager is not saying no and then passing work down to you?
No, he's not saying no. He's taken things on and he's buried.
Okay, so you cannot easily upwards train. You can downwards train. But the power doesn't flow up. I mean, you can say, hey, I'm worried about you, mate, depending on your relationship with your manager. But realistically, it's your manager's manager's job to address that, not yours.
But, in practice, what happens is Don and I are stealing things off of our manager's plate because he's overloaded. Like you look at our board and he's just stacked deep, way too deep. Do you steal without telling him? Or do you say, hey, I see your plate's heavy, so I'll take stuff? Yeah, I'd say, hey, I reassigned this to me because it looks like you're a little overloaded and I can handle this. So I'm just going to take this on. This is going to sound like a cop-out answer, but sometimes that's the best you can do. If you're asking about your manager and not someone you're managing, that is kind of the limits of your power. Unless you have a relationship with your skip level boss to say, hey, poke, your direct report needs you. But outside of that, you're kind of hitting the limits of your own power in that situation. Which is unfortunate, don't get me wrong.
My team has been telling me I need to get out of the on-call rotation, that I'm a terrible, we call it Batman.
Boyd, you know better.
What?
You shouldn't be in the on-call rotation.
Yeah, I would support your team on this.
I will support my team on it. Right now, though, that would mean that they're trading every 3 weeks instead of every 4. And that's just not acceptable to me. So
it's not acceptable to you, or it's not acceptable to them?
It's not acceptable to me that they have to give up 1 in every 3 weekend, period. That's just not, I mean, I can't accept that my people have to give up every 3rd weekend right now. I just don't, I can't swallow that, especially knowing that help is coming. Like I said, we're hiring. So I'm willing to sit tight for another, 3 or 4 months while we get these folks on board.
Did you
suck it up?
That?
I have.
Okay.
And we have agreed, but I think it was interesting because you had said, talk to the skip level manager. So that's another thing I have in place. I've asked my boss to try and have a monthly one-on-one with at least 2 or 3 of my team, so that he's got his finger on the pulse of things. And if there's a problem that he sees it coming, and if possible, he can even communicate it to me so we can fix it before it's a problem. So there was a lot wrapped up in what you were saying. That I've worked hard to put in place as best I can. And again, I see great benefit to it. So I'm sorry, all that in support of what you were saying.
It's cool. It's cool.
I want to jump in as an individual contributor that actually has had this problem of saying no and being afraid of, okay, am I going to make people mad? And have actually made people mad. Sometimes you will make people mad. People don't like being told no. a big part of it, and as this is something that the managers can help with, is having I know that a lot of times as individual contributors, we hate process. We just, hey, I just want to get stuff done. I don't want to fill out Jira tickets and sprint plan and all that whatnot. But process can kind of be that safety net. So the answer might not be no. The answer might be not right now. And if you have something in place where someone's saying, hey, I need this thing done, you can say no by saying, oh, okay, well, here's a board, file a ticket, and yeah, we'll see who else is having this problem, and we'll prioritize it accordingly. That's not a no. But it's also not a, oh, I'm going to stay till 10 p.m. tonight and get this done for you. So I think that's something that both individual contributors and managers, that's kind of symbiosis, can have in place, where it's like, okay, maybe we don't like process, but process might be the safety net of allowing us to work on the right things versus like, oh, I'm too afraid to say no to this one person, so I'm just going to stay up all night and do this thing for them.
Yeah, and I'd also say, and this is going to be another harp on the manager's time, there's an added layer where if you scope out what requirements are, right, then you should be empowered to say no because it exceeds scope of team or whatever it's exceeding, right? I can't do this because this is actually somebody else's job. It's not my lane, whatever. But if the person that's asking you don't feel comfortable saying no to, your manager should be the person to take that hit. Like you should have a relation, like in a good managing situation, you should be able to say to your manager, I need to say no to this person and I can't. They should.
Yeah, and then part of that is an individual contributor is like, don't be afraid. Sometimes things are on, if you, in DevOps, a lot of places I've had, there's a support channel, there's a Slack support channel. Someone like, hey, my Jenkins build is failing, I don't know why, or, we do this one pipeline different than everybody else, and the person who made it is gone, that sort of thing. So, you might be the person tasked with like monitoring that and making sure that people aren't just throwing into a void and not getting their questions answered. Don't be afraid to at your manager. Don't be afraid to be like, hey, at person, like, can we make a ticket on our backlog, or should I drop this other thing I'm doing? And that gets them, because they might not be monitoring that channel, so they might not be privy to the conversations of what's actually happening. Don't be afraid to put them into the conversations. It's not escalation. It's task management. It's different.
Yes.
Prioritization, and you should always be able to ask the people above you for priorities. Sorry.
Yes. No, that's absolutely correct. I mean, whenever I'm really grateful for the manager I have now who's exceptional and actually manages people. But when there's requests coming down the pipe and there's conflicting requests in terms of time management conflicting, I'm like, who gets done first? And what expectations can I set? And what can I offload and whatnot? And that is manager's job to triage or assist you with triaging or whatever makes sense.
And one thing that I don't think happens enough that I was taught through a leadership training program was communicating acceptable trade-offs. So
yes.
if I have a task that I know needs to get done, there are things that I as the leader or the manager or whoever the PO are going to know, this is the bare minimum. This is what I absolutely have to have done. These things are negotiable, and there's not enough of that goes on. And you have to be able to go upwards and say, okay, yes, you have this request. Let's peel this back. Let's figure out exactly what you need right now and solve that problem. And then we'll put the other things on our backlog to figure out how to solve those later, or those types of scenarios, because it doesn't happen very often. And I've been in organizations where I've been brought in and I'm running a team, and it's kind of a support operations team. And there was one individual who was the hero who would never come to me for prioritization or approval to work on something. He would just do it. And 2 levels above me, they would just go straight to him. And I finally had to step in and talk to the leader 2 levels above and say, this stops now, because he's affecting the rest of the team. He's working all night. He's not effective, and he's actually damaging what the whole team is able to accomplish. And I've since been moved away from that organization, and that individual is now running that team and he is not successful running that team because they didn't change his behavior pattern, and then they just went right back. Because when they asked me for things, they knew the first response was I would say yes, but you're going to do this for me, or we need to do these other things in relation to this, or I can put it on the backlog and prioritize it. But nobody else in the area was doing that.
So I have a concrete example of some little things you can do to combat that. I'm actually going to give this as a talk at Cloud Austin next week on the 20th. Any of this like rings interesting to you guys. So I mentioned that we use the handle Batman. And the reason that we do that is because we had one guy, Casey, who is everyone's IT concierge, and he couldn't get anything done. And so what we did was we put the Batman Slack handle in front of all of us. And for example, I'm Batman this week. And so something hits me and I don't know how to do it. Maybe I do have to ask Casey, and maybe he did take the interrupt, but the knowledge also got transferred to me. And we've retrained the entire company over the last year to use this Batman handle. So if you're anybody, even the CEO, and you don't know something, you can say @Batman and likely either get an answer or be directed to the person who can. And our upstream process queue is Robin. So yeah, it was really cool to see you take the thing that we had done tactically and sort of turn it into, these are the reasons why you're doing it. I've been so excited to see this. Thanks.
Hey guys, I've been listening a lot to you guys. My name's Ilya, I'm an SRE, and I just recently joined a new startup that's really well funded. And what I want to say is it's about 120 people in the company now, and so it's a very fast growing startup. And our engineers of like 18 or so, I joined about a month ago. What really helps on our team is everybody, when we come to work, when we like do retros or stand-ups, it feels like a freaking award show or something, because everybody's just praising each other. Everybody's just clapping for each other. And if something is, there's a ticket or somebody's stuck, there's no such thing as like, oh, I really want to work on this ticket or that ticket. Everybody's just, it's like all for all, whatever you want to call it. Everybody just wants to contribute and help. And my manager tells me, well, we have full trust in you as the SRE, run things exactly how you think it should be. You're the expert, and if you need anything, come to me. It seems like ego is left at the door with everybody on the team, and that really, I feel, lubricates the gears in the organization. So there's nobody's getting caught up on, what the any sort of a training or psychology or any of that. Not that those things don't matter, but I don't know if I just happened to fall into a very fortunate situation, and I'm grateful for it, and I knock on wood. But it's like, just ride the positivity, and if you see any negativity, try to squash it right away, because as soon as that negativity starts, it's like a cancer that's just going to start growing and growing and growing, and that's how you have all these sort of processes or different steps, playbooks start out by like how we're gonna do this next time, how we're gonna overcomplicate things. It's like, no, we're just gonna come and say it to our face and like, dude, that sucked, or that was great, and just like in a great relationship, just say it how it is. If you need to add your boss, be like, hey boss, I'm not trying to step on your toes. I'm just here to make things better. And if you're with that, cool. If not, I'm at the wrong place. And see what the reaction is. Let me know what you guys think of that.
I feel like I keep seeing Boyd almost say something, so I'm trying to see if he's gonna.
I've never been
a Boyd. Boyd can talk until and everybody leaves, and then keep talking. This is your show, ma'am. Go for it.
So I would say that most people are more fortunate than we all realize when you encounter a good manager who can actually people manage as opposed to just scope the work. Because usually if you're promoting someone into a management position, they can at least do, to a certain degree, the project management side of management. These are the inbound. This is the outbound. This is the assignment pool. Go, right? They can't do any of the people stuff. So I would say if you find yourself in that situation, that's definitely a touch wood, be happy, glad situation. There's a lot of, if you're not in that situation, which is far more common, you either have a good project manager type of manager or worse, sorry. You're really in a situation where you kind of need to self-help your way into a good space, depending on whether or not you're empowered to not have that manager anymore. So that's my 5 cents of follow-up on that.
I think I just got really fortunate because I had a bad manager as well, so I've seen both sides of the coin. So even the CEO was like, "Hey, I'm the CEO, but we're all on the same level here. We're all trying to drive this thing towards like a multi-billion-dollar company, and everybody's gonna get paid at the end, and everybody comes to work like, let's do this freaking thing."
Sometimes when you get too far removed with like C-levels and whatever, they can be like, yes, vision, and like neglect the entire working process that makes the vision happen. So there is that. So there, yeah. Rounding back around to what you said about stamping out toxicity, that is something that you can do even if your manager is, for the most part, you just have to do so in like a candid but respectful way, depending on the limits of your scope of power, right? How senior you are and whatever. Because usually when you're talking about cultural change, you either have it out of the gate or there's a driving event. The example that people like to give for a driving event is a bankruptcy event. Like, oh no, we're about to go under if we don't establish DevOps. Therefore, we should establish DevOps, whatever. People don't normally undergo the labor of making people behave in a way that they are not accustomed unless there's something about that way that's broken, right? Broken badly enough to teach them different. But if you can kind of just nudge things in the right direction the entire way, you can slowly but surely like get an upward tick, especially if you can get people to agree to do it with you. Not necessarily, don't dogpile on a single person, but so that you don't feel like you have to watch the entirety of the corporate Slack. Like if you and 4 people are just like, every time we see it, whoever calls it first is going to handle it. And we're going to see if we can normalize this behavior. Yeah.
And the key word there is respect. I think as long as everybody has respect for each other and they're not just trying to one-up each other or trying to sound like a know-it-all or whatever it is, and just remember that everybody's in it together for something, not just like, hey, look at me to 2 managers above because you're trying to step on your manager's toes or whatever, you're going to succeed. But if you're going to be that rock star that's going to go to the CEO and then the CEO is going to, it's like a teacher's pet thing. And then you're doing your best, but the teacher's pet is not doing anything, but he's the teacher's pet. So he's getting more credit. That kills me.
I would say I think that's why when you pointed out metrics, I mean, metrics, yes, are very easy to game, but having a bit of objectivity allows to sort of chip away at the subjectivity, right? Like, if that event you're talking about, maybe it doesn't necessarily need to be an event. Maybe it's by taking a kind of an audit of the current metrics and having those against like industry standard and or maybe taking a little bit of advantage of, say, the cargo cult, where it's just like, well, Netflix deploys this many times a day and we want to be as successful as Netflix. Like, granted that I personally don't like the deployments per day DORA metric, but it gives in a way of saying, well, we're trying to improve. And so let's take a look at our situation and realize like there is a lot of room for improvement. And if everybody's just kind of tied into, yeah, I want to improve because, I don't want to wait 2 weeks to get my code out the door, or I don't want to be in these 5-hour long incident meetings. That can be enough to push the change of, yeah, let's get good DevOps practices, or et cetera. So metrics are important. It's just, don't go too hard and reward gaming those metrics.
And there's also something you said about, I mean, it's not just Netflix, but any of those tiered companies where people like Facebook, Amazon, whatever does X. So we should also do X the same as they do X. You're trying to mirror their results by mirroring their process, but you are not Facebook, Amazon, etc. So you can totally set the goal of, hey, we want to improve our number of deployments, and then go back to asking the question so you actually understand your situation and say, what makes sense? What is our rate of change? Like if we're increasing our number of deployments slowly, let's say we do 1 a week and we want to make it 5. Let's see how long it takes us to go from 1 to 2 to 3, like how long this actually takes us to do consistently, and then set a goal for how long it's going to take us to hit 5. And then see if 5 meets the goal that it's supposed to meet. So like you don't just pick 5 as a random number. You say the reason we want to have more deployments is to meet some, like whatever, some formal corporate speak as to why you want more than what you have. There needs to be a why, otherwise why? But you can totally increase things in a way that makes sense to meet a different need if there is one. But just and this is why I was like, don't Google things. Don't Google things. But don't Google things because you're not Google. You know what you want, because it might be entirely possible that you're like, oh, more deployment sounds better because more is better. Oh, we don't need that.
Yeah, it sounds like what you're saying is properly measure, and then after you have your measurement and you're ready to, you have a game plan, stay in your lane and crank on it instead of getting into the Google lane or the Facebook lane.
Well, it's not just about know your measurement and stay in your lane. It's know why you want it before you measure anything. Like ask why first.
Oh yes, you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that asking of why can kind of help spur that cultural change, because it's very easy to just kind of be myopic and you do your things and you're just like, yeah, what do you mean? It takes 2 weeks, or yeah, it takes everybody's got to get together and take all day to deploy. It's like, that's just what we do. And if you're like, or more what, the hero talk is, oh yeah, no, we have an incident and, Joe always fixes it. And yeah, it takes 3 hours and, 10 other people are on the call, but, that's just what we do. And sometimes standing back and saying, let's actually look at that and come up with measurements around that can kind of help with well, maybe we shouldn't always have Joe fix these. Maybe we should have less of these incidents, or maybe we should have ways of resolving it faster. Well, what does Joe always do? Is he just clicking a button? Is he the only person that knows how to click a button? Maybe we should invest some upstream work in automated a script that does that. So my main thing is that the point I'm trying to get across is that the measurements are great, but sometimes just the cultural shift of measuring versus just sort of going with the personality of whoever's pet project gets picked. That's enough to shift to work towards a cultural shift that sort of brings all these things that you're talking about, Q. That's mainly my point.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't even have anything to add. Just
yeah, turning to
A+.
what Boyd was doing with Batman, I think that's a good idea because, to get rid of Brent, you need somebody to pair with Brent instead of Brent just fixing the problem. Somebody needs to pair with Brent to figure out what Brent is doing. And then somebody else besides Brent can fix the problem the next time. And so I don't want somebody to fix my problem for me. I want them to show me how to fix the problem. Or the next time somebody comes to me for help, yeah, I will help you, but I'm going to show you how to fix what the problem is so you don't need my help next time.
And there's, depending on the complexity of the task, there's definitely something to be said for shadowing and then reverse shadowing. And by that, I mean, like, you have a Brent, someone shadows Brent, and then Brent shadows them. And they drive. until they don't need to be shadowed anymore.
All right.
Yeah, exactly.
So real quick, we're almost at time, but if anybody has any last questions for Q on her talk, last chance.
I'd like to point out that there's a bunch of reading you can do on what Q and Bailey were just talking about. It's the difference between tribal knowledge and institutional knowledge. And this is generally talked about a great deal when you're going through something like ISO certification, or even in some of the SOC 2 language, which is so typical for most of us today. So if you want to dig in deeper on that notion of who knows what and why, that you can search for, but don't Google it. Tribal knowledge versus
Google it, just, Google with caution.
Yeah,
right?
don't Google it to do what Google's doing, I think was your point, right?
Yeah.
Exactly. You're not a FANG, don't be one.
Yep. If you're not FANG, don't FANG.
All right. And on that note, Quinn, do you have anything else you want to tell everybody? Any last thought?
No, I mean, I got a lot of good questions, so I'm pretty content with that.
I got a question. How do you pronounce your name?
Quintessence.
Quintessence. This is the first time I've ever heard that name.
Yeah, it's not common.
What? It's not common though.
No.
Cool.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Quinn, for joining us. We really appreciate that you were here. So virtual round of applause. And anyway, so a couple last notes. Again, if you want to keep up with the Meetup, you're more than welcome to follow us on meetup.com. I believe we have a very special episode next month. We'll be hearing more information on that, but I hear it's a very special one. So we'll see what that turns into. And hashtag Austin Devops on Twitter. And there's a live stream, which should be closing about now. Y'all